She baked her victims into soap, not metaphorically, literally rendered human fat into bars she sold to neighbors who complimented her on the quality. And that's not even the most disturbing part of her story. Female serial killers account for roughly 15% of all documented serial murder cases worldwide. But because they rarely fit the profile we've been trained to expect, they stayed hidden longer, killed more, and in several cases were never fully suspected until the bodies were already counted. These women didn't lurk in shadows with weapons drawn. They smiled at you. They cooked for you. They sat across from you at church. And then they killed you, quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary patience. By the end of this story, one name is going to permanently change the way you think about trust. Stay with it. The farmland outside La Porte. Indiana smelled like manure and wood smoke in the early 1900s. Rural, isolated, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business and strangers passed through without being remembered. That's exactly why Belle Gunness chose it. Belle was a Norwegian immigrant, heavy-set, physically powerful, described by those who knew her as composed and practical. She had already collected on 2 suspicious fires and the deaths of 2 husbands before she began placing advertisements in Scandinavian newspapers across the Midwest. The ads were personal notices. A widow of means seeks a financially stable partner. Interested men were instructed to liquidate their assets before arrival to prove they were serious. They came. Farmers, merchants, laborers who had spent decades building something real. They arrived at her property with cash, sometimes thousands of dollars, and were never seen again. Neighbors occasionally noticed fresh digging on her land, but in farm country, nobody asks about soil. When fire destroyed the farmhouse in 1908, investigators found headless bodies in the rubble and began excavating the grounds. The confirmed count reached at least 9 victims, though researchers believe the number exceeded 20. Belle herself was never definitively identified among the dead. Some believe she staged the fire and walked away clean. The case was never officially closed. What made Belle effective wasn't brute violence. It was architecture. She built a system of trust, written correspondence, and financial incentive that brought victims to her willingly. The farm wasn't the trap. The advertisement was. That psychological blueprint, patience, manufactured intimacy, and calculated exploitation surfaces repeatedly among the women on this list. But the next one weaponized something even closer. Something taken from victims inside their own homes. Nanny Doss lived in mid-century America and looked every part of the cheerful domestic housewife. She clipped recipes from magazines, wrote to Lonely Hearts columns, and was described by everyone around her as warm and giggly. Between 1927 and 1954, she poisoned 4 husbands, 2 children, 2 sisters, her mother, and a grandson. 11 confirmed deaths stretched across nearly 3 decades. The method was arsenic, introduced quietly through food she prepared herself. She spaced the deaths far enough apart that no single one triggered serious investigation. Husbands died of vague stomach complaints. Children passed from unexplained illness. Each death was mourned publicly, loudly, with grief that read as entirely genuine. She collected life insurance after several of them. When she was finally caught in 1954, after a doctor found arsenic in her 5th husband's body and raised the alarm, she smiled through her interrogation. She reportedly laughed at certain points. When pressed on why, she offered no coherent answer. She seemed almost genuinely unbothered, as though the question itself were beside the point. Nanny Doss is terrifying not for the body count alone, but for the duration. Decades of undetected, sustained violence inside the one-space society had assigned to women entirely. The home wasn't just her cover, it was her method. Across the Atlantic, in wartime Italy, Leonarda Cianciulli had convinced herself she was performing necessary sacrifice. She believed her actions were protecting her son from dying in the war. She believed it deeply enough to document everything in private journals she never once destroyed. 3 women were killed between 1939 and 1940. Leonardo approached each under the pretense of friendship and opportunity. She drugged their wine, killed them, and processed the bodies methodically. The fat was rendered into soap she sold locally. Other remains were incorporated into tea cakes she served to guests. She recorded all of it in calm, deliberate writing. What makes Leonardo psychologically singular is her complete absence of denial. She did not run, lie, or minimize. She explained. Her confession was so composed and internally coherent that it became a landmark document in criminal psychology. She was committed to a psychiatric institution and died there, maintaining to the end that everything she did came from love. Now, to the name that most people have never heard, the one that reframes every assumption this genre carries. Because the story of the true crime world consistently underreports isn't set in an isolated farmhouse or a quiet suburban kitchen. It unfolded in plain view, in broad daylight, inside one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, Mexico City, late 1990s. Elderly women began turning up strangled near their homes. A figure seen leaving several scenes was described by witnesses but never detained. Investigators called the suspect La Mataviejitas, the old lady killer. For nearly a decade, over 40 elderly women died. The profile investigators built pointed toward a man. That assumption cost years. Juana Barraza was a professional wrestler. She competed under a mask, was physically powerful, and had spent years moving through public spaces completely unremarked upon. When she was finally arrested in 2006, caught leaving the scene of a murder, she carried a forged social security document suggesting she had posed as a government worker to gain access to victims inside their homes. She was convicted of 11 counts of murder, though evidence connected her to significantly more. The reason Juana Barraza rarely appears in mainstream true crime conversations alongside killers with comparable numbers comes down to the same force that protected every woman on this list. The cultural image of what a killer looks like simply did not include them. It never had. That blind spot is what Belle exploited in print, what Nanny used inside her kitchen, what Leonardo leaned on through manufactured friendship, what Juana weaponized across an entire city for nearly a decade. Female serial killers in documented crime history are not statistical outliers. They are recurring patterns, and the single most consistent thread running through every case explored here is not the method, the motive, or even the victim type. It is the delay. The years and sometimes decades separating the first killing from the moment anyone began asking the right questions. That gap is the real story. And it opens the moment society decided it already knew what danger looked like.
Welcome to Crime Reveals.